think I know most of you, but in case there are a few whom I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Susan Whistler, and I'm the executive director here at the Mount. And it's wonderful to see you. I'm sorry that we had to abandon our comfortable and spacious tent, but it's a sea of mud under there at the moment. So I'd also like to share one of our upcoming programs. This Thursday at 5, it will be the fourth of our new concert series, Concerts of Music in the Dell, which will happen on this grassy knoll just beyond the stable. The band is Berkshire County's own Misty Blues, and they'll be playing original and traditional blues with hints of jazz, soul, funk, and tent revival gospel. So Soma will be on site with their wonderful food truck. We will be selling wine, beer, and other beverages, and seating is on the lawn, so if you do decide to join us, please bring a blanket or a chair. Advanced registration is sold out, but if the weather is good and we do remain outside, we will be accepting walk-ups. So I hope you can join us on Thursday at 5. Now, I'd like to introduce today's author. Lisa Napoli is a seasoned journalist and author of 4 books. Her first, Radio Shangri-La, is about the impact of media culture on the mysterious kingdom of Bhutan, where Napoli helped start a radio station at the dawn of its democratic rule. Lisa's second book, Ray and Joan, is about the late philanthropist Joan Kroc and her husband, the irascible founding chairman of the McDonald's Corporation. Lisa's third and fourth books, she turns to media history. Up All Night looks at the origin story of CNN, the world's first all-news cable channel. And Lisa's fourth book, and the subject of today's lecture, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, is the story of the, quote, Founding Mothers of NPR, women with whom I'm sure most, if not all of us, have spent many, many hours over the course of our life. The New York Times hails Lisa's latest work as, quote, a lesson in how the fringe project of one generation becomes the mainstream of the next. And the Washington Post writes that Napoli chronicles not just the camaraderie of Stanberg, Wertheimer, Totenberg, and Roberts, but also their commitment to help the careers of younger women who aspire to follow them. The review goes on to state that, quote, the founding mothers in word and deed offer a powerful lesson on what can happen when we carry as we climb. So now please join me in welcoming Lisa Napoli.
Good morning. Thank you so much for braving the sogginess to come hear me talk. And I'm not going to, I think many of you are regulars at these lectures. I don't like to lecture, so I'm just going to have a conversation with you and set it up with a little bit of information after that lovely introduction by Susan. But I wanted to start by asking if any of you consider yourself to be news junkies. Somehow I had a feeling if you were here that you might be. Radio or cable or all? Cell phone, everything?
Radio.
Radio. But every input is often the device, yeah. So I grew up with a news junkie. My father, my late father, Vince Napoli, raised us in Brooklyn, New York, in Flatbush, if anybody's from there. And in the 70s, he would come home from work every day. He was a salesman to our house on Argyle and H, if that means anything to anybody, in Brooklyn. And he would have an armful of newspapers. And then he, at dinner time, would turn on the television to watch the news. And then, not while we were eating dinner though, that was back in the days when that was impolite. And there was usually just one TV in the house. And then at night, he'd fall asleep to talk radio, New York City talk radio. And so he was my introduction to news junkiedom, and it's not surprising that I became a journalist as a result of that, because that was sort of the input in my universe, my youthful universe at that point. And I fell in love with the news business as a way to the wider world, and was really fortunate when I was 17 years old, going to Hampshire College, not far from here. And I, by accident, that I won't get into here, got connected to this little startup news channel called CNN that was then in the base of the World Trade Center. The New York bureau was. Of course, the headquarters was in Atlanta. Ted Turner was very famous then. And I don't know how many of you remember, judging by the crowd, many of you do probably remember that in 1981, when I went to work there as a 17-year-old intern, Most places didn't have cable. Especially if you lived in the city, cable was a very unusual concept still. In the outer lying areas, cable was really just a utility. It wasn't an industry that changed the world. But nonetheless, I was this young person, I wasn't even barely a young woman, at this crazy news outlet that no one in New York could see, and that only a couple of million people in the whole country could receive at that point, because that's how new both CNN and all of cable were. I was working in this newsroom and I was dazzled by it and overwhelmed by it and never really loved television, but that's how I started my career. Fast forward many years, I worked at the New York Times in the early days of the internet and the web, and then later worked at MSNBC as the internet correspondent, lost my job at age 37, a perilous time for an on-air person in television to lose their job, and then wound up working in public radio by accident. And there's a reason I'm telling you all of this. I spent my career as a news junkie, not making very much money, but making a living as a news junkie. And finally, after 9/11, I bottomed out. That just knocked it out for me. There'd been a big layoff at MSNBC. That sort of made me turn the television off. And around that time is when I got into public radio, which I really hadn't listened that much to, not being in the car a whole lot, and wound up loving public radio. And I realized about 10 years ago, as Susan mentioned, I wrote this book about going to Bhutan and helping start a radio station there, that I was burnt out on the news business, burnt out on consuming the news, and very interested in the history of the news business, which is why I wound up writing that first book about CNN, to understand not just the evils and perils and polarization of cable news today, but to look backwards and figure out how that place that altered my life, set my life on a very distinct path. Because when I got out of Hampshire, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, which was a very different universe in 1984 than it is now, to work for $5 an hour overnights at CNN. Glamorousness abounds. So all of that to say, how did I write this book about the founding mothers of public radio? Well, I wrote this book about Ted Turner and CNN, which turned 40 on June 1st, 1980. So it's only a couple decades old. Some people don't imagine that there was ever a time without it, but there it was. It was the first all-news cable channel, of course, and that's when that book was published. And when I delivered the book in September 2019, my editor, Jamison Stoltz at Abrams Press, said to me, "What would you like to do next?" Which is very flattering, because you don't usually have an editor ask you for your next book unless you're, Simon Winchester or Walter Isaacson or something like that. And I said, I want to write a single person biography. I don't want to write a biography of a place. I want to write an individual biography. And he said, well, why? Cokie Roberts had just died. And he said, well, why don't you write a biography of Cokie Roberts? Because, editors have to make money and they want a marketable book. And she had just passed away and there wasn't one. There wasn't a biography. She had written a number of books herself. And I thought, well, that's interesting. She's, I love origin stories. I was very curious about women who came before me, how they made their way at a time when things were different than women, which I, of course, was well aware. But I started rooting around, and I talked to several of my former public radio colleagues who said, you should write about the founding mothers. And I said, well, founding mothers, who are they? Founding mothers, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie. And I didn't really understand why they were the founding mothers, except that they'd been there for a long time. And I knew nothing about the origins of public radio, which of course is now a major institution, extremely well funded. I knew about Joan Kroc having given this landmark $250 million gift when she died, which knocked the socks off of the people at NPR because they really weren't expecting it. They were hoping for maybe a few million, not a major portion of her estate. Although I might add, not the major portion of her estate, because she gave the bulk of her estate to the Salvation Army to create recreation centers all around the country in poor neighborhoods, free recreation centers, that aside. So I started rooting around, and then when I realized that NPR turned 50 this year on May 3rd, 2021, I said to Jamison, we have a peg, and they love pegs, timely pegs for books. And I was off to the races with this book. And little, of course, did any of us know that a deadly pandemic would shut the world down. But thankfully, before it did, I went to this incredible repository of information about public broadcasting at the University of Maryland, where Susan Stamberg had left her papers. And she was an incredible record keeper, a meticulous record keeper. And sifting through her personal papers, both her personal papers of her papers, her school papers at Barnard, where she'd gone to school on scholarship in the 50s, to her memorabilia from when she was a young married woman trouncing around India. Her husband worked for the Foreign Service, and she went to India in the early 60s, which is an interesting time ever, but I mean then in particular for a woman to go who was not from a well-heeled family, it was an incredible adventure. So I sort of tracked the arc of her life and realized that this was a really interesting story to tell, because Susan's life really tracks the arc of public broadcasting, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with her. Much younger people don't know her work as well as we who have been around a little bit do. But Susan literally was there at the invention of public broadcasting before it became that. It was called educational broadcasting. And when radio spectrum was allocated, and I won't talk too much about that because it's kind of a snooze unless you're a nerd about technology like I am, when spectrum was allocated at the creation of radio, institutions, nonprofit institutions, universities mostly, in some cases churches or schools, got this educational radio spectrum on the far end of the dial that was sort of seen as, not important. At that point, nobody was really sure how radio was going to develop, but somebody recognized that it was important to cordon off a space of radio that would be non-commercial. So for many, many years in radio's development, educational radio was literally an experiment. And it was attached to these institutions that didn't have budgets, rarely had budgets. It really was just an experimental thing. Susan, as a young woman, young married woman, her husband's work took him to DC. Before they had gone to India, she was looking for a job that was something other than as a typist. And many of you probably are aware, and it might have happened to you, that women, regardless their education, could not get jobs other than as service industry. And even in the pink-collar, white-collar world, pink-collar is what it was called, they were relegated to these jobs. And Susan was tired of being a typist and worked her network of people who she'd known and met through Barnard, which I'm sure there's an alum here. She worked her network and found out that there was a job at this little new educational radio station in Washington called WAMU. They were hiring their first staff person, and it was a producer for a public affairs show. And Susan had never worked in radio before, but she'd grown up listening to the radio. She loved it. It opened up her world in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which was not a fancy place when she was growing up there. And she loved radio, never had dreamt of working in it. And this friend of hers said, they're looking for a producer for the show. And Susan said, what's a producer? What does a producer do? And the friend said, doesn't take no for an answer. And Susan, who was never a shrinking violet, said, okay, I can do that. Sign me up. And even though the producer job at WAMU paid less than her typist job did, her husband was eager for her to get more experience and be happier in her work because he saw how unhappy she was. So they agreed that she would take this lesser paying job that sounded really interesting, even though she didn't know what it was, and the show was brand new. And listened to, as she says, probably by about fewer people than are in this room right now. But as we all know, that's the best place to get your start, right? Nobody's paying attention, so you can make all kinds of mistakes. So Susan got that job, and from that job, continued on with her life, enjoyed the radio, went on the air a little bit, because it was one of those places where everybody did everything. And fast forward to the late 60s, some of you may remember this, there was great concern about commercial media, mostly about television. At that point, radio was marginalized. Television had come along and big-footed radio off the main stage. And, at that point, it was 20-something years old, and people were really, smart people, were really starting to be concerned about the deleterious effects of watching too much television. I remember, as a kid in the 70s, people talking about couch potatoes. Of course, the remote control hastened couch potatodom, and people were very worried about not just that people were watching too much, but that what they were watching, and how there was violence and sex and craziness, and that the news was minuscule. It was just served up 3 times on 3 networks once a day at 6:30 for 20-something minutes. There wasn't a lot of news and public affairs because it was not a profitable world. It was seen as a public service on the part of the people who were producing and making all this money on the airwaves, on the commercial airwaves. So in 1967, the Public Television Act was introduced by Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and people who you'll hear more about Lady Bird next week. I wish I could be here for that. And he literally, this act was all about creating a public television entity. And there were some people at these educational stations around the country who said, no, you have to include radio. And the television people said, well, we'll do that later. And the radio people knew it later would never come for them because radio was such a hidden medium. So that's what they literally called it, the hidden medium. So they prevailed, and I detail this much more in this book, while I'm looking at the rise of the women's movement that gave birth to these women's careers. And radio was attached to the Public Television Act, became the Public Broadcasting Act. And in 1971, a couple of people, because there weren't very many people who worked in radio, and even fewer who worked in non-commercial radio, who came to Washington and started National Public Radio. And they literally had no idea what it was going to sound like, what it was going to offer, what it was going to be. They had a small meeting, because there weren't very many of them. The budget was $5 million for NPR when it started. And the idea was to come up with something that could feed out to some of these educational stations if they could qualify to carry it. And to qualify to carry it, you had to have a budget over $25,000 a year and be on the air a little bit more than a few hours a day and transmit to a wider area than this campus on which we're sitting right now. So there were only 90 stations in the network to start. And these people sat around, and they were mostly men, and they said, well, we'll do a public affairs show. We're not sure what it's going to cover exactly or how we're going to staff it exactly. And maybe it should be more than an hour, but not 2 hours, so why don't we make it 90 minutes? And, drive time radio, morning drive time is the best time to do it, but then we'd have to wake up really early, so maybe we should do it at drive time in the afternoon when people are driving home. Of course, what they didn't factor in is at that time, FM radio was not built into most cars. FM radio was a relatively new phenomenon. So the audience they were trying to reach who were driving home couldn't even hear it because the cars weren't equipped for it. You had to pay extra for that. Most people didn't. All of that to say that just like with CNN, where there were all kinds of crazy escapades that almost shut down CNN from launching, like the satellite went missing, Ted Turner went missing at sea in a yachts race. He couldn't sell the station he was trying to sell in Charlotte, North Carolina because of all sorts of shenanigans, and so he didn't have the money that he was cashing in to leverage it. Same sort of thing with public radio. It was just a series of missteps and accidents that gave birth to the show All Things Considered, which the engineer of the show, who'd come over from AMU, came up with the name, and he had the winning name, All Things Considered. So they said, okay, great, let's do it. And what they did was they started hiring anybody who was willing to work for next to nothing and at a place that had really no clear vision. And of course, that included among the very first two hires were Susan Stamberg, who was working part-time at that point. She'd had her first baby. She didn't want to work full-time. So they hired her as a production assistant. And then they hired Linda Wertheimer, who was a young married woman who had been stymied every time she tried to get on the air at WCBS News Radio in New York because she kept being told, you can only work behind the scenes. You'll never be on the air. Women are not authoritative enough to deliver the news. So in the very beginning, there was something like 25 or 30 staff people, as I say, including Susan and Linda, who were hired behind the scenes. And it was so ragtag that basically if you raised your hand and said you wanted to do a report about something, or in Linda's case, she recognized, this place needs some organization and none of these guys who are running it are very organized, so I better be the director. So she literally made herself in charge of taking in the tapes, which at that time were these large reel-to-reel tapes that had to be edited. You sliced your fingers open while you were trying to edit the tape. And Linda was the traffic cop, is what basically the director is, of the show to start. And there are these harrowing stories of the beginning where no one knew when the tape was going to come in, and there was no length. Now, you can all probably recite the NPR clock in your sleep because you know that this is when they're going to cut to the local announcements and the local. But then they had no clock. So basically, if the first story of the day was 15 minutes long, which it might be, a documentary really, the first host, a man named Robert Conley, would riff for minutes until he saw the tape being thrown in like a frisbee into the control room and wired up on the machine, or laid out on the machine and played. So that's how cuckoo it was at the very beginning. And that was what was so much fun for me as somebody. I went to work in 2004 for the public radio show Marketplace, which by then had been around for a couple decades, I think, or at least a decade. And NPR was a major force. It was a major network. It was on par with the other networks. It had the staff necessary to engine it all day. To know its roots was just as exciting for me as knowing the roots of CNN, which was created in a retrofitted Jewish country club in Midtown Atlanta, that several of the people who worked there had been to bar mitzvahs when it had been they're both crazy, wonderful stories that I think are important parts of the dialogue, back to my news junkie question earlier on, to understand how we got to this stage where people are news junkies, where the average person who's not in the news business is a news junkie. Because that wasn't how it used to be. Most of us remember that there was a time when news wasn't funneled into our every orifice at every minute of the day, and when something happened, we couldn't find out instantly. It was a different universe. And so it's been very interesting for these last two books to go back in time and understand the roots of all of that, which happened to be as I was coming up in that industry. And we can talk about this when you start asking questions, but I think it's pretty much destroyed it. Where did all this fake news come from? It came from the fact that anybody is now a reporter and anybody has the tools. And of course, the other side of that is it's great that anybody has the tools, because when NPR and CNN both started, there were 3 networks they had the stranglehold on the broadcasts, and anybody, not just women, anybody who wasn't in that rarefied universe couldn't penetrate that world. The people who started CNN were all from the newsreel days. They remembered the days when movie-tone news had been, an alternative to the networks, or it was the precursor to the networks. So all of these little historical bits make it really clear, this sort of march of time that led us to this moment that we're in right now. Some people say history's bunk. I don't think so. I think it's really interesting to see that NPR didn't come out as this fully formed NPR entity. It really was ragtag. And these women's stories are a major part of it because they were able to take these jobs. 3 of them had husbands when they walked in the door who were willing to subsidize their meager salaries. And the women walked in the door having no idea what their jobs really would wind up being, but excited to just have a place that for once allowed them to do what they really hoped and wanted to do that no one else would allow them to do. For that, thank you so much for your time.